Our next guest has a special skill set to offer us today. Josh Lerner is the Jacob H. Schiff Professor of Investment Banking at Harvard Business School and Head of the Entrepreneurial Management Unit. Much of Josh Lerner's research focuses on venture capital and private equity organisations, which you'll find spread through his 3 books, The Venture Capital Cycle, The Money of Invention, and Boulevard of Broken Dreams, which sounds a little more ominous. He's also in the midst of some Harvard Business School research on Australian and Queensland entrepreneurship. And in this session, I'll ask you to join us as I'm introducing you. In this session, we're also joined by Rick Holliday-Smith, the chairman of Cochlear, one of Australia's most innovative companies, also chair of the Australian Stock Exchange. And Rick will participate in the conversation after we've heard from Josh Lerner. Would you please give a special welcome to Josh Lerner?
Thank you for the nice introduction and the chance to be here. It's really terrific. I've been given a daunting challenge, which is we have a big topic here. We've got 25 minutes, and while I may use my 25 minutes, I promise not to use a moment more. And we'll certainly have a chance in the discussion that follows to dig into some of this stuff. And I think I'll be very eager to hear Rick's perspective on some of the questions here. What I think is clear is if you look across the world, across the G20 today, you see enormous amount of interest in trying to promote entrepreneurship. This isn't just something that's unique to Australia, but one sees almost everywhere. And it's easy to understand where this comes from. First of all, you look at a lot of places and you discover that jobs is something that people care a lot about. And how do you get jobs? Well, the disproportionate way in which jobs get created is by entrepreneurial businesses, what we sometimes call gazelles, you name it, these sort of high-growth, high-potential businesses, rather than large companies where things are more stable. Secondly, we tend to like innovation. There's been just a whole body of work that suggests the way that economies ultimately grow is by innovating and coming up with new ideas, whether it's new products or new services or new ways of doing things. And if you look and say, who innovates, it's again disproportionately the small companies who come up with the ideas. It's not always necessarily the ones who end up commercializing it, but those are the guys who originate the new ideas. And in particular, if you look at that sort of subset of firms, which is the ones which are the entrepreneurial, the ones which are backed by venture capitalists, they seem to be particularly high-powered. So just to sort of throw out one factoid, for essentially every dollar of venture capital seems to be as efficient in terms of promoting innovation as $3 to $4 of corporate R&D. There seems to be just simply a lot of bang for the buck. Governments want jobs, governments want innovation and growth, so it's not surprising that one has this interest in these businesses. And the way in which this sort of usually gets translated is to say, we want Silicon Valley in fill in the blank, right? And you go almost everywhere in the world and they say, we're creating our Silicon Valley in here. And there's a sense of saying we're somehow missing out. You know, there's all the good stuff there. You know, maybe there's some in Boston and, you know, some in Berlin and, you know, a few places around the globe. But, you know, why don't we have that and why don't we make this thing happen? And it's a little frustrating, right? You look at the pool of venture capital and how it's distributed around the globe. You know, after decades of discussion about globalizing, well, you know, there is China and India and Canada and then a whole bunch of other little places, but it's still basically a U.S. game. Now you might say, well, the U.S. is this isn't fair. The U.S. is a big economy. Let's look at it on a per capita basis. Well, that helps a little bit. You get, you know, Hong Kong being very big, but that's sort of really reflecting the fact that, you know, so many Chinese companies choose to domicile in Hong Kong. It's because they have a few, you know, minor things like rule of law and so forth that make it nice to be located there. But so that's not a number you can really take very seriously. And then you see it's basically U.S. and Israel and China, and then it falls off, falls off pretty rapidly from there. And you know, yes, the good news is Australia's in front of a lot of other places, but it's certainly not exactly overwhelming by any kind of measure there. And in some sense, it's very reasonable to say, from a policy perspective, we can do something about it. You look at the experience of the United States, Silicon Valley didn't just appear out of nothing. Instead, it was basically a situation where there was a lot of hand-holding in terms of government, in terms of directing procurement out there, in terms of facilitating things, in terms of the Small Business Investment Company program, which really allowed a lot of the initial funds and the initial lawyers and bankers and so forth who go about servicing high technology startups to form. There was also obviously a fair amount of engineering of a tax code and other things to be favorable for these kind of businesses. Again, you look at Israel, which is certainly from a per capita basis that we saw really way up there in terms of activity. Again, this wasn't something that appeared out of nowhere. There was sort of a very deliberate set of policies that basically led to many foreign venture firms deciding to locate there and being involved in the activity there. Admittedly, they did it on a very cheap basis and actually made a profit on their policies from doing it. But again, without the hand of a public sector, it wouldn't have happened. We could talk a lot about how these various programs worked. The Yozma one in Israel is particularly interesting, where they basically said, here's a pot of money. If you come and set up a fund, they actually were quite radical about it. They said, we don't want Israelis. Israelis don't know how to do venture capital. What we want is Americans and Brits and Taiwanese to come over here. And if you put in $1, we'll put in 50 cents or 75 cents and match it. They even put a little sweetener in terms of saying, we'll limit how much of a return we can get. And it ended up being, fabulously successful in the sense that, today, I think by most measures, essentially Tel Aviv is the third largest cluster of venture activity in the world of any urban area. Even when you look at, sort of closer to home, the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund, you see a lot of pretty interesting aspects. Obviously, New Zealand's got lots of challenges. It's remote and so forth, and many of the issues we'll talk about in the Australian context reappear here. But again, you can see a sort of very well-designed program that quite thoughtfully managed to elicit and nurture and mentor firms, venture groups, in terms of going out and doing investments. So, what do you see about these efforts? Well, I think there's a few things. One of which is, essentially, it's not just trying to substitute for private money. It's essentially providing matching funds, saying we're going to let the market provide the direction as to where to go. It's not just sort of helter-skelter, but trying to say, let's at least put some rules in place to try to get good people to do this stuff. Often, sort of a lot of simplicity, not trying to engineer some really complicated thing. And the other aspect is, that once it actually works, the government actually steps aside and says, let the private sector take its turn in terms of doing things. Unfortunately, it's not all great successes. This is one of my favorite examples. So this is, I went to, the Swedes have this sort of Swedish Davos, where they all go off on this island in the Baltic Sea, and they get together, and all the politicians and NGOs and unions and lobbyists all get together on this sort of big shindig in the middle of the summer. And they asked me to come and talk about some of these issues. And one of the guys who was there was sort of this eccentric but enthusiastic guy who basically shipped over from Stockholm this thing. And they say, why did he bring this over and put it outside my speech? Well, essentially what this thing was is the Swedish post office at a certain point decided to go into the car manufacturing business. And their idea was saying, well, we deliver a lot of mail. Sweden's a big country. And we're pretty good at knowing what goes into a car. They, of course, were like, we also want to encourage economic development, so let's put it up in Lapland, and which, of course, is a real hub of auto manufacturing of all kinds, and just made a whole series of bad decisions along these lines. Anyway, the fellow who brought it along was sort of one of these really eccentric guys. Most of the guys I know who are car collectors, are into Aston Martins or Ferraris or something like that. He was into loser cars of the world. So he said that, one of the things he's a big collector of those East German ones. What were they called? Trabants, right? he had apparently had 3 or 4 of them, and he said, well, actually the Swedish post office car ran worse than the cardboard East German car, which is really sort of setting the benchmark low. So needless to say, this wasn't exactly a great stellar example of government efforts to promote venture activities. So in theory, there's a lot of compelling cases for why government can be useful in terms of doing this process, but there's also some very real dangers. And one of the real challenges is to sort of avoid the pitfalls that are out there and emphasize the positive lessons. I think one of the good news one of the pieces of good news is that there's been enough mistakes made and enough successes that if we look carefully at what's been done successfully and unsuccessfully, we can get a pretty clear roadmap as to what to do. And I would emphasize 3 points in terms of effective policies. First, there's sort of this universal temptation to sort of go immediately into handing out money. It's just so tempting. I think politicians around the world love, sort of getting at least the American version of this is they get a big oversized check and hand it to somebody and get their picture in the paper doing this. It's just really fun. But I think you see lots of examples of cases where governments have sort of just said, let's go and hand out money to entrepreneurs, to venture capitalists, without worrying about getting the environment right. And it's just a recipe for disaster. And I mean, again, we can talk about lots of examples. I think, certainly one would be if you looked at, some of the policies in Japan, for instance, during the 1990s, when there was a lot of money put to work, but the government hadn't really done the homework in terms of creating a tax policy that was friendly to entrepreneurs. It was extremely difficult even to do stock options and other kinds of grants. There was all sorts of regulatory and barriers in terms of people, in terms of careers, that made it just simply very hard to be an entrepreneur. And as those sort of programs tailed down, the venture industry just plummeted. It was basically, in some sense, really an artificial creation of government funding. So starting by saying, what are really the barriers in terms of the environment? How can we set the table to make it friendly for high potential ventures? We can talk about taxes. We can talk about the various barriers to people moving around and taking chances. Trying to limit the penalties of failure. If it's really onerous, if you don't succeed, it's not going to be much of a temptation to go out and take risk. Thinking about public markets and so forth. We've already talked a little bit about handing out funds, and we said if it's going to be successful, it can't just be, we're going to replace the private sector in terms of doing this. It really has to be a notion of matching funds, or saying, whatever is sort of going out, you've passed the market test of being able to raise money from elsewhere, then we as the public sector can complement it and give a little bit more and helping things along. Otherwise, it just sort of tends to be quite a challenge. One of the things that you see when you look at successful venture industries around the globe is that an important factor for these things is having essentially a vibrant local industry that's essentially funding these things, typically in the form of pension plans. And essentially, these pensions are often longer-term investors who can make the kind of commitments that they are certainly experienced in the U.S. and many other places. And I think that certainly when you think about Australia, this is certainly one of the big challenges here. I just compared, for instance, the 10 largest Australian super funds over here with US endowments, for instance. And you see how the alternative stuff, the private equity and hedge, is so much smaller than is the case over here. It's much more likely to be in, just sort of the plain old stocks and bonds. If we were to look a little finer and look at particularly venture capital, we'd see that it's just the tiniest of slivers here among the Australian institutions. They've just not really supported this activity. The last lesson that I think very much stands out is that this is, to use the old metaphor, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So often, politicians love to jump into this, says we're going to do this program. 18 months later, they look around and say, nothing's happened. Let's give it up and go on to something else. This is certainly building a vibrant venture culture is really a process that takes really decades as opposed to months, and it needs a kind of commitment in terms of this process. In the introduction, I got alluded a little bit to in terms of what our team is doing in terms of looking at Queensland and trying to make some suggestions potentially about what could be done in terms of encouraging the entrepreneurial environment. And this is, again, something that, it's a fascinating topic, and I could happily talk for hours about. I'll just spend a few minutes on it. And we're definitely in the mode of saying there's been a lot of thinking done about this already. We've obviously spent a lot of time reading through and looking at it. We've also gone through a sort of very much of a listening process. So in our last visit, we basically sat down with something on the order of 75 of the key stakeholders and got a lot of different perspectives around many of these issues. Just to say a little bit about, sort of what we bring to the table. We've done similar kind of things in a lot of different corners of the world, from Canada and the UK. On the one hand, economies which are in many respects, share a lot of similarities to Australia, to sort of more far-flung and emerging kind of economies like Jamaica. I was also involved, sort of, and this really dates me, in the sort of last days of the Howard administration. There was an Australian venture capital review, and I was sort of the outside expert. And sadly, we identified a lot of issues at that point, which I'm afraid are still lurking on there. And as was alluded to in the introduction, my rather ominously titled book, The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, really deals with both the bad news as well as the good news about how governments can go about encouraging high potential new ventures and what's there. So this is certainly a great privilege to be working on this. So to just give a sense of what we've heard through our listening process, one of the things that really very much stands out is the sort of seriousness with which this is being approached. That there's certainly been a lot of programs, a lot of money spent, and a lot of people have thought very seriously about this. At the same time, it's also clear there's some real challenges, right? We also heard a lot about skill sets, saying that essentially we know that one of the things that makes places like Silicon Valley so powerful is you've got a lot of entrepreneurs who have been through this a bunch of times before. You've got a lot of venture capitalists who backed a lot of companies. And that's clearly something that doesn't happen overnight. It can only really happen through trial and error. And certainly on the scientific side, one of the themes that came through most clearly is saying that, well, it's clear that in Queensland particularly, there's been an enormous amount of investment in the research side in terms of developing, sort of state-of-the-art science and insights. That translation of it into commercialization has been an enduring challenge. We could talk about the venture industry for quite a bit as well, but I think it's fair to say that whatever else we can say about it, perhaps young is probably the fairest word to say, right? That we know there were, early on, there were relatively small number of groups, perhaps, with the benefit of hindsight, just like has happened in many other places, mistakes were made. And it's certainly been challenging to get that kind of critical mass that certainly characterizes the successful clusters of venture activity that's there. I think we've talked a lot about, some of the challenges around innovation. Certainly one of the interesting themes was, the fact that innovation, a lot of the innovation that's taking place today and a lot of the value that's being created isn't really anything that's sort of fundamentally technological innovation, but it's really more business model innovation, right? You think about something like, Uber or something like that. You say, well, fundamentally, it's really about sort of how you take the existing pieces and combine them in a variety of different ways that need to look beyond research-oriented innovation. And we also, of course, heard a lot about geography, saying that just being in a place which is a relatively small economy, which is far away from other places, it poses a very real challenge that even if you get people who come up with great ideas, the temptation to go elsewhere, to be lured away, is an enormous challenge. It was there in the conversations, and certainly it's there in the data. I didn't want to sort of belabor us with numbers, but certainly here, if you look at the share of Queensland employment versus, in the kind of tech kind of jobs, whether in, scientific and technical and IT, we see that, certainly it lags not just simply the other states in Australia, but it clearly lags many of the other leading developed countries. If we look at R&D, again, we see, here I just simply put it relative to the other states. Again, one sees this sort of pattern where there is, certainly some challenges. I think there's a couple observations we ought to make before we, which are important, which is first, this is not an issue which is unique to Australia in any sense. I put this quote in from an interview we were doing with one of the Canadian deputy ministers last week, where he was talking about the challenges around commercialization, saying, we in Canada have funded all this research, we haven't done enough commercialization. I was like, this is just out of our Queensland conversations. In a way, this is a sort of much more generic kind of issue which is out there. Similarly, if we think about the venture industry, we can see many places which have struggled with it. Even in the US, we see many of the same kinds of challenges. So while it's easy to sort of point to the problems, it's also sort of reassuring to say everyone else is struggling with exactly the same kinds of issues, the same kind of issues there. So I think that one of the important things is not to, sort of say, oh, it's a challenge, it's difficult, it's not going to happen. But to say, let's really instead look around the globe and see where are the really interesting creative stuff being done to address some of these issues. And I think we can find tons of examples of really interesting stuff here that might have very real applicability in terms of addressing some of the issues we've highlighted. And I won't talk about all of them, but think for instance about this problem of insularity or the cross-fertilization that we talked about. There's a number of programs like the Startup Chile program where they say, let's go and get really interesting entrepreneurs and get them to come to Chile, place far away from everything else in the southern hemisphere. And meanwhile, let's go and take a bunch of entrepreneurs from Chile and have them spend a little time in Silicon Valley and get them exposed to some of the people and the ideas there. Let's just sort of work on that sort of flow of ideas. Failure, right? There's certainly been a lot of talk here about saying, people don't want to take chances, they don't want to stand out, there's sort of fear of failure. Again, you can see a lot of creativity. The one I like the best, just simply because it's such a wild and crazy idea, is something they do in Singapore called the Phoenix Award. And the idea of the Phoenix Award is that they were like, people in Singapore won't take chances. It's too safe to go to work for a corporate job. So they said, let's just create an award for the most meritorious failure of an entrepreneurial idea. So the idea is that if you fail, but fail gloriously, you get in to see the PM, he shakes your hand, you get a trophy, you get a little check, and the idea is to say, let's just go and try to create a little culture that encourages more in terms of taking chances. We talk about 20 other things. This is a topic I love and could keep on going for many hours, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just sort of leave it at that and sort of throw out, sort of 3 key points to wrap up. The first of these is, I'd like to say this is really easy, right? You can just sort of turn the crank and it happens, right? What we know is it is a competitive world out there. There are a lot of people out there struggling to try to get entrepreneurial ventures to locate in their place and to encourage this kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's also clear that wasn't perhaps the case 20 years ago, but today there's a clear roadmap of what to do. There's some very well publicized successes, and there's some very well documented failures. And it's certainly possible to draw on both what's worked and what hasn't worked, and that if you sort of go out and do that process, it sort of very much provides a roadmap for the thing. And I think that if Queensland is serious about this and makes the kind of investment both in terms of thinking about it and then doing the steps that are required to go out and implement it, it's reasonable to think that the entrepreneurial sector, the venture sector, will play an increasingly important role here going forward. So that's it for the formal thing.